Long time ago in the city of Rama, as the sun dipped low over the hills of Rama, casting long shadows across the village. The air was thick with the smell of baking bread and wood smoke as women hurried to finish their chores before the evening meal. Yet, while the village buzzed with life, one home stood quietly still, as if the world outside didn't exist. Inside, a woman sat by the open window, staring out at the fading light, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her name was Hannah, and although her heart longed to be filled with the joy of children, her arms remained empty. She was a beautiful woman, dark-skinned with deep brown eyes that shimmered with a quiet sadness. Her husband, Elkanah, loved her deeply, but even his affection couldn't ease the burden of her barrenness. In their culture, a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to bear children. And despite her beauty and kindness, Hannah felt as though she had failed her husband and herself. The taunting from Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, cut deeper than any knife. Peninnah, who had been blessed with many children, never missed an opportunity to mock Hannah. "Hannah," came Elkanah's voice from the doorway, breaking her reverie. She turned to see him standing there, his expression soft with concern. He was a good man, strong and gentle, his face etched with lines of care. "Why are you crying again, my love?" "I'm not crying," she whispered, brushing away the stray tear that had betrayed her. Elkanah walked over, kneeling before her, and gently took her hands in his. "Hannah, am I not better to you than 10 sons? My heart belongs to you alone." Hannah gave him a sad smile, grateful for his kindness, but the emptiness inside her remained. "You are, Elkanah. But my heart longs for a child of my own, for the cries of a baby to fill this house." Elkanah sighed, stroking her hands. "God has his reasons, Hannah. He will provide in his own time." But Hannah couldn't shake the deep longing, the ache that never left her. She turned her gaze back out the window, watching as Peninnah's children played in the yard. They were laughing, their voices high-pitched and full of life. Peninnah appeared at the doorway, her arms crossed, and her gaze settled on Hannah with an icy stare. "How fortunate you are, Hannah," Peninnah said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "To have all this time to yourself. No little ones to run after, no mouths to feed. How easy your life must be." Hannah stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She had no response. What could she say? Her heart twisted with pain as she watched Peninnah's children run into her arms, calling out to her with affection. Elkanah stood, his face tight with frustration. "Enough, Peninnah," he said sharply. "Leave her be." Peninnah shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I meant no harm, only that she must enjoy the peace and quiet." She turned and disappeared inside, leaving Hannah and Elkanah in the silence that followed. Hannah's heart felt heavy, weighed down by years of disappointment. No matter how much she prayed, no matter how hard she wished, her womb remained closed. And the emptiness gnawed at her. "Come inside," Elkanah said gently. "The meal is ready." But Hannah shook her head. "I'll comment in later," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elkanah hesitated, then nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before leaving her alone once more. As the sounds of the evening filled the house behind her, Hannah remained by the window, her thoughts consumed by one simple, fervent prayer: "God, remember me." The next day, as the sun began to rise over the hills, Hannah found herself walking toward the temple in Shiloh. The journey was long and hot, but her heart drove her forward, her legs carrying her as if by some invisible force. Every year, Elkanah took his family to the temple to offer sacrifices to the Lord, and every year, Hannah prayed for a child. Yet every year, she returned home empty-handed. But this time, something felt different. There was a desperation in her that had grown too strong to ignore, a need so deep that she could no longer bear to carry it alone. When they arrived at the temple, Elkanah offered the sacrifices as usual. Peninnah and her children gathered around, laughing and chattering, while Hannah lingered at the edge of the crowd, her heart too heavy to join in the festivities. She watched as the priest, Eli, made his rounds, blessing the families and offering prayers. Hannah felt a tug at her soul, a yearning so deep that it pulled her toward the temple steps. Without a word, she slipped away from the group and knelt down at the entrance, her hands clasped tightly before her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered her prayer, her lips moving in silence. "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Her whole body trembled with the force of her prayer. She had never prayed like this before, never poured out her soul with such raw emotion. Her heart ached, her voice cracked, but still, she prayed. She could feel God's presence, as if He were listening to her every word, and it gave her the courage to continue. As she prayed, her lips moved, but no sound came out. Eli, the priest, noticed her from a distance. He frowned, watching her for a moment before approaching. "Woman, how long will you keep on being drunk?" he asked, his voice stern. "Put away your wine." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "I am not drunk, my lord," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I am a woman deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer, I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." Eli's expression softened as he realized his mistake. "Go in peace," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah's heart soared with hope at his words. She bowed her head, thanking him, and rose to her feet, her tears finally drying. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were filled with quiet anticipation. Hannah returned to her home in Ramah, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't know when or how God would answer her prayer, but she believed with all her soul that He would. One evening, as she sat in the quiet of her room, she felt a strange sensation in her body, something she had never felt before. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, her heart racing with both fear and excitement. Could it be? Could this finally be the answer to her prayers? She ran to find Elkanah, her face flushed with excitement. "Elkanah," she said breathlessly, I think I am with child." Elkanah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you sure?" Hannah nodded, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "God has remembered me." The months that followed were a blur of joy and anticipation. Hannah's belly grew round, and with each passing day, her heart swelled with gratitude. She knew that this child was a gift from God, a blessing beyond measure. And when the time came, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. She named him Samuel, which means, heard by God, for she had asked the Lord for him, and He had answered her prayer. Hannah cradled Samuel in her arms, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around hers. His skin was soft and warm, his breathing steady and peaceful as he slept against her chest. She had never known such joy, never imagined that her heart could feel so full. The years of sorrow and longing seemed to melt away in the face of this new, overwhelming love. But even as she held him close, a quiet thought lingered at the back of her mind, a promise she had made, one that she could not forget. She had vowed to give Samuel back to the Lord. The thought sent a pang of sadness through her, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had made a covenant with God, and now it was time to honor it. She wouldn't keep Samuel from the life that had been chosen for him. "Soon, my son," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Soon, you will serve the Lord." The months passed quickly, and before long, Samuel was old enough to be presented at the temple. The day arrived when Hannah and Elkanah would make the journey to Shiloh once more, this time with their son in tow. Hannah's heart ached at the thought of parting with him, but she knew it was not a goodbye, it was a fulfillment of a promise. At the temple, Hannah approached Eli, the priest, with Samuel at her side. She knelt before him, her voice steady and strong despite the emotions swirling inside her. "My Lord," she said, her voice filled with reverence, "I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord." Hannah's voice trembled slightly, but there was no hesitation in her heart. She had waited years for this moment, not to part with her son, but to fulfill the vow she had made to God. Samuel, the miracle she had prayed for, was now to serve the Lord for the rest of his life. As she knelt there, holding her little boy's hand, her heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. Eli, the priest, looked down at the child standing beside her, then at Hannah, his eyes softening as he recalled the day she had poured out her soul in desperate prayer. He nodded, placing a hand on Samuel's head in blessing. "The Lord has indeed answered your prayer, Hannah," Eli said. "This child will be a servant of God all the days of his life." Hannah smiled through her tears, rising to her feet as Elkanah joined them, standing silently in support of his wife. Together, they offered a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, their hearts full of gratitude for the gift they had received. The following morning, the time came for Hannah and Elkanah to return home. but this time, they would not be bringing Samuel with them. Hannah knew this day would come, but now that it was here, the weight of it settled heavy on her chest. Samuel was still so young, barely weaned, but he was destined for a life dedicated to the Lord's service. As she knelt beside him, adjusting his robe, she whispered in his ear, "Be brave, my son. You are a gift from God, and He will watch over you always." Samuel looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, still too young to fully understand the magnitude of the moment. But there was a calmness about him, a quiet acceptance that reassured Hannah more than any words could. She kissed his forehead, holding him close one last time before rising to her feet. Elkanah stood nearby, his face etched with quiet sorrow. He placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder as they turned to leave. Hannah glanced back one final time, watching as Eli took Samuel's hand and led him into the temple. Her heart ached, but there was peace in knowing that her son would be raised in the presence of the Lord. As they walked away from the temple, Hannah whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill over. "Thank you, Lord, for remembering me. Thank you for hearing my prayer." The journey back to Ramah was long and quiet, but Hannah's heart began to stir with a new kind of joy, a joy not born of earthly circumstances but of the fulfillment of God's promise. As they traveled, she began to sing, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the road beneath them. Her song was a song of praise, one that echoed through the hills and valleys, proclaiming the greatness of the Lord. She sang of His power, His mercy, and His faithfulness, her heart swelling with gratitude for the miracle He had given her. "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies. For I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God." Her voice carried through the air, reaching the ears of those who heard it along the way. They marveled at the beauty of her song, at the depth of her devotion to the God who had blessed her. And as she sang, Hannah's spirit soared, lifted by the knowledge that she had not been forgotten. Back at the temple, Samuel's new life had already begun. Eli, the aging priest, took the boy under his wing, teaching him the ways of the Lord. Samuel was eager to learn, his young mind absorbing everything with a quiet intensity. Though still a child, there was something special about him, something that set him apart. The days were filled with tasks, sweeping the floors, tending to the lamps, and assisting Eli in the daily rituals of the temple. But in the quiet moments, when the hustle of the temple had settled into silence, Samuel would often find himself standing before the altar, his small hands clasped in prayer. He didn't know much yet, but he knew enough to feel the presence of the Lord, to sense that his life was part of something far greater than himself. Eli had told him stories of how the Lord had spoken to the great men of old, how He had guided their people through the wilderness, how He had made promises and kept them. "Will God speak to me one day?" Samuel had asked Eli one evening as they sat together by the temple's entrance, watching the stars blink into the night sky. Each year, when Elkanah brought his family to the temple for the annual sacrifice, Hannah would visit Samuel. Though they were no longer together every day, her love for him had not diminished in the slightest. She would bring him new clothes, lovingly stitched by her own hands, and they would sit together, catching up on all that had happened in the months since they last saw each other. Samuel would tell her about his life in the temple, the things he had learned from Eli, the tasks he had been given, the prayers he had prayed. And Hannah would listen, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the boy he was becoming. "You are growing so fast, my son," she would say, brushing a hand through his dark curls. "Soon, you will be a man." Samuel would smile up at her, his eyes bright with the joy of their reunion. "I miss you, mother," he would say, his voice soft but sincere. "And I miss you," she would reply, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But you are exactly where you are meant to be. Never forget that." Hannah's story is one of faith, perseverance, and dedication. She teaches us that no matter how deep our sorrow, when we turn to God in prayer, He listens and answers in His perfect timing. Through Hannah, we see a powerful example of trust and faith in the Lord's plan.